Welcome to Onega Historical Society and Museum. We are feeling great to have Rosie Bosse come, a local novelist and storyteller, and she happens to be my neighbor down the road. She's been writing since 2016, she told me, and lives on a little farm there, and she can probably tell a little more about herself, but please welcome her.
Thank you. So when Debbie asked me to do this, she wanted me to kind of do an introduction on what the Civil War series is going to be. And this series will actually take place until 2025. We have 11 books in the current series to finish that one up. So number 9 will be out this fall, 10 and 11 will be out next year, and then the spring of 2025 is when the first Civil War book will be released. And when I started writing novels, I knew that I wanted to do something on the Civil War because that era has always fascinated me. And quite frankly, one of the things that I've always wondered is, you know, when you hear people talk about the Civil War, and especially when they mention Civil War medicine, the first thing that comes up is the number of amputations. And so that was something that it was like, when I do this research, I'm going to find out why that took place, and now I know. So, but anyway, the Civil War, when I was trying to decide where I was going to start it was actually the quilt turning that you guys did was what really inspired me to start it where I did, because the quilt turning, for those of you that were there that day, you remember that was about the border war between Missouri and Kansas. Now that conflict started long before the Civil War. But one of the things that they talked about that day was General Order 11. And that was when they vacated the 3 counties completely in Missouri and most of the 4th county. And as I sat there and listened to that, I love history, and I've always loved history. And unfortunately, you know, when you get into high school, maybe your attention isn't where it should be, and maybe it was because the interest of the teachers wasn't where it should be. You know, who knows what it was. But for whatever reason, I didn't get a good background in history when I was in high school. And I think our grade school did a good job of geography, but I don't remember history being so promoted. And of course, when you get in college, they don't want to talk about American history. They want to talk about world history or ancient civilizations or whatever it might be. And so as I was trying to figure out when I was going to do this, I decided to start it right in the area where General Order 11 had just taken place. And so that actually makes this book start, even though it's a Civil War series, it's going to start on September 1st of 1863. Now, if you think the Civil War was over in 1865, so we're kind of right in the middle. Where the next book will go, I have no idea. I don't even know how this one's going to end. When I write the books, I don't write an outline. This is probably the closest thing that I have to an outline is right here, and it's not an outline. I record it as I go. This is my timeline. So I print off a calendar of 1863. I was going to say, wait, did I get the right year? So this is September of 1863. You can actually go online and print off calendars of any year that you want to. And then I use this as my timeline to keep track, because to me that's probably one of the hardest things to do, is to make sure that I've got my characters in the right place at the right time. You know, when sometimes we'll be watching Gunsmoke at home, and they'll say, I'm going to ride to wherever, and he's going to like there in a half an hour or 20 minutes maybe, and it's like, well, that didn't quite work out, but you only have a half an hour of a show to work with, so you know they had to do that. The other thing that I do is I try to figure out the miles, and that's pretty easy to do because a lot of our roads follow old trails, and so the trails were used, you know, by the animals and then the Indians and then the settlers, and then they built roads over them, and so I can get a pretty accurate feel of what the distance of the roads are. Now the thing you have to remember is, as you went farther west, the railroad didn't come, the Transcontinental Railroad didn't take place all the way through until 1868. So, but the Civil War was fought more on the other side of the Mississippi and on the border of Kansas and Missouri. You had some trickling into New Mexico, you had some going up in north, but we certainly didn't see the amount of conflict in the west that we saw in the Midwest or in the East. And I actually read somewhere that Missouri had more battles fought in that state than any other state, with the exception of like 2 in the South. So there were quite a few battles. But I want to just go into some of these terms, and I'll pass this around so you guys can see this. I redacted names so that you can't follow the storyline yet. But anyway, that'll kind of give you an idea of what's taking place. So one of the things that I found, and I saw this when I was doing research on the other series of books, the Home on the Range books, is depending on who the person is that's writing the historical account of whatever it might be, they tend to lean one way or the other. You know, in the West you saw them leaning more for the Indians, or you saw them leaning for the white man. Here, when I'm reading this stuff, you can see I'm leaning more for the North or leaning more for the South. So for example, this book right here has some great information in it, the Civil War on the Missouri-Kansas border. And I don't remember, I bought this book quite a while ago, back when I first decided to do this, but I did find it on some recommended research that I was doing, and so I pulled it out and I started to read it, and it has great miscellaneous information. When I got down to the massacre, the Lawrence massacre, the sacking of Lawrence, there's hardly anything in there on the date that took place. It talks about building up to it, and it talks about after it, but there's hardly anything on there about the day itself. So then I started reading some other things. I think probably this author was leaning a little bit towards the South. So, you know, it's interesting. This one I bought on eBay, and it's an old book, and so I thought, I love old books, so I'm always a sucker for old books, but this one is the true story of Chaz W. Quantrell. And so I thought, well, maybe if it's a really old book, maybe I'll get more of an accurate portrayal, and I'm just getting into it. So this book, the Civil War series, I've just basically started on. I'm 30,000 words into the first book, and each book is about 100,000 words. So, and that's how we do when we write novels. We don't go into pages or numbers or whatever, you go into words. And so, you know, when you're looking at it and you write your first page and it's like, say, 500 words, and you're going, oh my gosh, this is going to take me forever. And sometimes it does. But anyway, so I want to give you just a few definitions here. The definition of general orders, and because you'll see these listed throughout the Civil War, they did general orders for different things. But under martial law, the commander of the military forces and his provost marshals determined law and order instead of a civilian court. General orders were their commands, and they took on the power of the law. So when there was a general order given, whatever it pertained to, that became the law of the land. So General Orders 11 was issued on August 25th, 1863, and it required all Confederate residents of Jackson, Cass, Bates, and parts of Vernon counties in Missouri to vacate their farms and their homes. Now, this particular thing, what I was reading said Confederates. In another place it said everybody had to vacate. I think probably everybody had to check in, and you had to show that you were loyal to the Union Army, or you were going to be banished, basically. And so what they could do, those pledging federal loyalty, if you could convince them that you would pledge federal loyalty, you could take refuge in the federal military posts or in other towns. Of course, these were all women and children. The men were gone. They were away fighting war. And so these are women and children who are already struggling to make a living. Now, I have a real strong sense of right and wrong inside me, and when my justness is bothered, I'm angry and appalled. And I can tell you that if somebody had kicked me out of my home, killed all my animals, burned my house down, took all my possessions, sent me down the road without even a horse, because most likely the livestock was already stolen, or they took it that day and said, carry out what you can on your back. And by the way, if you want to pledge loyalty to the federal government, go ahead and check in at the next post. If you can convince them that you will be a faithful Federalist, you can stay, otherwise keep right on moving. Now I think about that point in time, I would have changed loyalties no matter where I was. So I think I would have become a Confederate right off the bat, right there. Homes, farms, and businesses were sacked and burned. The western counties became known as the burnt district. So there was nothing left there. And here was the order. All persons living in Jackson, Cass, and Bates County, Missouri, and in that part of Vernon, included in, and it gives you all these specifications, and I'm not going to do it because I don't have a map to pass this out to you, are hereby ordered to remove from their present places of residence within 15 days of the date hereof. Now, they were supposed to give them 15 days, but was the Redlegs that were basically enforcing this, and they were only accountable to General Ewing. And then he kind of took a hands-off attitude, because by the time this progressed farther, they became more out of control. Anytime you give people permission to have bad behavior, the bad behavior gets worse. And so the people that were in charge wanted to back off completely and pretend like they didn't have an affiliate. Yeah, we didn't know. You know. And so anyway, so these guys were just kind of unaccountable. So if they were in an army camp with a lieutenant or a captain and he gave them orders, they don't have to obey them because they aren't accountable to him. Well, that's not good for the morale of the rest of the troops. And so the military officers and the troops were not that crazy about the Redlegs because they thought that they had a whole different set of rules. And so anyway, officers commanding companies and detachments serving in the counties named will see that this paragraph is promptly obeyed. And so then they just started going from house to house, and they could give these people 15 days, but if they didn't feel like giving them 15 days, they could kick them out right now. And they got to take whatever they wanted. So they'd fill their horses with plunder and kick these women and children out on the street, on the road, not the street, what road there was, and probably with very few food supplies, because you got to remember, they were pillaging already for food supplies back then. So these were the Yankee troops that were doing it. Now, I haven't got into all the research on this, but the one company that keeps coming up time and again is the 7th Cavalry of Kansas. Again and again. That company keeps coming up. Now, who led that? What was the end of the 7th Cavalry? Anybody remember?
Custer.
Custer's last stand. So the 7th Cavalry ended up north and was taken out by a bunch of Indians, and Custer was the one who led that. Now, Custer's name I'm not seeing here when this is all taking place. I think he is still in, he was just fresh out of West Point, yeah. So anyway, this order affected around 20,000 people. It stipulated in the order that those who proved their loyalty were exempt, but that only affected 20% of the population. Plus, the exemption wasn't always recognized. Now, when I started this book, I decided, because it was such a conflict between the North and the South, and not just, it wasn't clean cut. It wasn't like you could say, everybody on this direction is anti-slavery loyalists who believe in the Union, and everybody on this side is pro-slavery, anti-Union, Confederate loyalists. It wasn't like that. And in fact, I'll read you a story here in a little while about a Confederate loyalist who was from Maine, who made a huge name for himself in the Confederate Army. And so, you know, it was all mixed together. You had people from the same family who had different feelings. So, you know, and for a lot of them, they were not, slavery wasn't an issue for them. You know, a lot of the people in the South, they didn't own slaves. And so whether you could own slaves or not own slaves, it wasn't an issue for them because they didn't own any, they couldn't afford any slaves. But then there was also a real anti-black feeling there, but it wasn't limited to the South. It was also in the North. And so it was just kind of a big mess. The Redlegs were ardent abolitionists. They numbered between 50 and 100. Now I'm going to have to check on that number because it also talked about specific military terms, and I don't know how many men those were. They were hand-selected for the type of work they would be required to do. Now here's something I found that I did not know. Wild Bill Hickok and Buffalo Bill Cody were among those who are known to have served as the Redlegs. Who knew that? Okay? According to Wild Bill Hickok, here's a quote from him. "We were the biggest thieves on record." So some men went on to serve in the 7th Kansas Cavalry as well as other regular Army commands or state militias. Illegal raids by the Redlegs eventually led James Blunt to publicly disavow them, although he kept known members on his staff. So here is this politician, this congressman, who's saying, no, I don't agree with the Redlegs, you know, what they're doing is really bad. But he has people who are avowed Redlegs working for him. But, you know, so there was just so much corruption. Kansas Governor Charles Robinson, an ardent Unionist and Free State supporter, tried to have the Redlegs removed, and as a result they attempted to assassinate him. So anyway, I did read that this order, according to what I read, they said it worked because it emptied the counties of the fighting. It emptied the counties out. However, the people that affected were primarily women and children. The men were already away fighting, so in another place I read, it didn't affect that. What it affected that was the men were already moving on. The guerrillas were working to support the railroad, and so they had left that area already. And so, see, you just read everything, so you've got to sort through this stuff and try to figure out. And there will be some things that I'm not gonna go into. You know, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of stuff that I can't prove one way or the other, or maybe something that's real controversial. You know, is there going to be a real benefit in going into that? This is a novel. You know, it's not a historical documentation. Anyway, I question how many families were embittered and chose to take sides against the Union when they were neutral. And I had already decided that, and then I found it in some of the stuff that I was reading, that there were people who were neutral, but they were so angered by everything that had taken place that they became embittered and went one way or the other. So it was kind of a mess. The Jayhawkers were Unionists who professed to rob, burn out, and murder only rebels in arms against the government. I think it's ironic that our state, we are called the Jayhawkers, and we have Lawrence, who, you wait till I tell you some of the history of Lawrence. This is pretty interesting, but they're very proud to be called Jayhawkers. I'm not sure I'd be so proud to be called that, but anyway, whatever.
Ignorance is wonderful.
A red leg is a Jayhawker, originally distinguished by the uniform of red leggings. And I've read a lot of what they did to make these leggings red, you know, whether it was sewing a piece of red fabric or they started off with wool that they had stolen. But anyway, they were indiscriminate thieves and murderers. They had a headquarters in Lawrence where regular public auctions were held selling stolen horses and other Missouri property. Were the people of Lawrence indifferent, or did they just sanction the behavior? See, you know, and then again, you know, this is why this was all taking place before Lawrence was ever sacked. So the Redlegs are going across into Missouri. They are plundering and everything over there. They're bringing all their loot back here. They're setting up a public auction in the middle of the square in Lawrence and auctioning it off to the citizens and whoever wants to buy it. Everybody knows it's stolen. Everybody knows it's illegal, and it was still taking place. The bushwhacker is a rebel Jayhawker, or more likely, a Confederate who bands with others for the purpose of preying on the lives and property of Union citizens. So they were coming across. So you have the Jayhawkers and the Redlegs are going into Missouri. The bushwhackers are coming back across. And for the citizens of that area, they were caught between the two. So if you were loyal to the Confederacy, you're going to be targeted by the Jayhawkers and the Redlegs. If you're loyal to the Union, you're going to be targeted by the bushwhackers. And so when I start this book, that's exactly the conflict that I bring in. Because even though this is a Confederate family that I started with, her father works for the Union Army. They should have been protected. They should have never been banished off their land, but they were, and that happened. And so Lawrence, Kansas, writer Lucian Carr called the town a mere fence house for stolen property, once owned by Missourians. So, you know, I have to say, I'm not a big fan of Lawrence for a lot of reasons, mainly because they're not purple. But Anyway, it was pretty interesting, some of the things that I read here. So the Lawrence Massacre, the sacking of Lawrence, that took place on May 21st, 1856. The town of Lawrence itself was founded by anti-slavery settlements from Massachusetts. So the majority of the town of Lawrence was not Kansas citizens. They were people that came in to help make the state anti-slavery. And there was a lot of movement back and forth across the border before the war ever started. You know, when they started voting on this, is Kansas going to be a free state or is it going to be a slave state? Is Missouri going to be a free state or a slave state? And so people would move back and forth across the borders voting so that they could sway these elections. Governor Charles Robinson predicted that the Kansas Jayhawker raids into Missouri between 1858 and 1861, the Lane Brigade from 1861 into early 1862, followed by the Redlegs and the Missouri Union militias, would result in a group of Missourians seeking revenge. So some of the stuff that you'll read is that Quantrill was busy long before all this started, but according to that historian, it took place, he was a result of all this other stuff that was taking place. And he said, and if you don't believe that, look at the amount of plundering that took place by Quantrill's raiders during the war versus what took place before that ever took, what happened in Missouri before that ever took place. You don't see the amount of goods going out of Kansas that you see going out of Missouri. So that was his thinking, was that this raiding, all this raiding that took place in Missouri built up the guerrillas in Missouri as a fighting force. And so anyway, so interesting. That'll be something that I'm not sure what direction I'll try to go in there. I'd like people to kind of form their own opinions on some of that stuff, but I do want to bring out things that I can prove, you know, so if I can pull out something like that. One of the things that I found was Benton Barracks, and this was in St. Louis, and they took an old fairgrounds and they converted it into a military post. And they called it a military encampment, and it took place in 1861 at the St. Louis Fairgrounds. There were originally 5 buildings, 740 feet by 40 feet, plus one 2-story building that was the headquarters for the barracks commander. It housed up to 30,000 soldiers. That's a lot of men, and that would be Union. It was primarily a training facility for soldiers attached to the Western Division of the Union Army. Now when they say Western, I'll have to look that up, but I would assume it's west of the Mississippi, is what I'm going to assume. We're not talking west as in Montana, Idaho, that area. By 1863, so it was established in 1861, by 1863, over a mile of barracks, warehouses, stables, parade grounds, and a huge military hospital were all part of Benton's barracks. After the Battle of Lexington in Missouri between September 18th and 20th, 1861, the post and convalescent hospitals were added. And so the hospitals were added after the war started to treat the hundreds of incoming wounded. And the fairgrounds, that amphitheater, was converted to a hospital, and it could accommodate 2,000 to 3,000 patients. Now, when you read these numbers, they did not have the bodies to handle all these people. You think about how many patients one nurse in our hospital handles, like 3 or 4 patients per day. There were not that many nurses. And granted, they were taking volunteers from everywhere, but they worked. They had a lot of patients. Nurse Emily Parsons, and I'm going to bring her out in my book because I was really impressed with her story. She was a single woman. She never married, but she was one of those people that I think she walked into a room and she got you all straightened out and got you in all the places you were supposed to be. And she ran a dang efficient hospital. And so she oversaw this hospital at Benton's Barracks, and it was the largest hospital in the West, and she kept a journal of her experiences. So with that, we can get some good information. There were no major battles fought near St. Louis, but the Mississippi River was a really important method of travel for both the North and the South. So there were skirmishes there, but no major battles that went down in history. It did remain under Union control for the entire war, which is not surprising with that many soldiers there. even though it was a training facility. But the town itself, St. Louis, was again very conflicted. It had some very loyal German immigrants who lived there, who were very loyal to the federal government. But then it was a division, the rest of the town was a division between north and south. And so you never knew, unless you knew your neighbor well, you didn't know if they were a southern sympathizer or a northern loyalist. So here's something that I thought was interesting. Now, if you guys have read the novels already, I mentioned Custer in my 4th novel and just kind of barely talk about the Battle of Little Bighorn, but I'm not a Custer fan. I'm going to be real upfront about that. I do not like George Custer. I think his wife is the main reason that he even made it to history, because she spent the rest of her life after he died building up his reputation and writing memoirs, and she was a good wife. And you know, something that they don't talk about, when he was stationed out west, and I can't remember the name of the fort, but we used to go by it all the time on our way to Colorado. I can't remember the name of it.
West of Oakley.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't think of the name of it.
W.
Yeah, he went AWOL out of there and went back to Fort Riley to visit her. Now, most officers, when they go AWOL, they were rooted out of the Army if they weren't hung. You know, a lot of them probably would have been shot. They didn't do that. They just sent him back to Washington, D.C. and gave him a desk job. And then, that was right at the beginning of the Civil War, because he had friends in high places. Livy, his wife, her family had friends in high places, and those became his friends in high places. And so they brought him back as a Civil War, I forget what he was, a lieutenant or captain, and by the end of the war he was way up there, General George Custer. So anyway, but here's some trivia about him. He entered West Point in 1857. He graduated in 1861, last in his class of 34 people. Congratulations. I made him a ghost character in this book. So in other words, now you guys know I'm not impressed with him, but I'm not going to diss him in here, because there are people out there that absolutely love George Custer, and there's no point in bringing my personal opinions into that, right? But I can make him, I can make my hero officer have a fight with someone else who had friends in high places, and that affects this person's career. Okay? So when y'all read that, Captain Hedrick will never be any more than a captain because he fought with the wrong person. So, America's hospitals were not prepared for the devastation of the new mini-balls. And this, I'm just getting into the guns and the ammunition, but one of the things that my sister, who's a veterinarian, and I could have called you, shoot, I've been calling Mary all this time. Anyway, I always call her when I want to have a horse get shot or a person get shot. Do I want him to die? I don't know. Do I want him to die? Yes or no? If I want him to die, where should I shoot him? You know, where should I have this horse get bitten by a snake?
Bloodthirsty she be.
I'd be bloodthirsty. That Jerry Conner thinks I'm terribly bloodthirsty. But anyway, so one of the things that Mary told me was, you know, the human body is pretty miraculous, which we all know because we know who created it. But it will literally pull itself back when it feels an object coming in. The guts will pull themselves away. They like retract. And so that came out in here too. And so when they had the round musket balls, because they traveled slower, the guts had the time to get pushed out of the way. And so a shot in the stomach with the round musket ball wasn't as devastating before the Civil War and all these other battles. But once the Civil War started, they started using these conical shaped metal balls, metal encased bullets, and they were absolutely devastating to a stomach shot. So if you were shot in the abdomen during the Civil War, you were most likely going to die because it did so much damage. Now on the other hand, the round bullets, when they went through someone's chest, because they were moving so slow, they didn't make it all the way through, so they kind of bounced around in there. They tore up more of the chest area and caused more damage to the lungs and made it harder for someone to heal that way, where the conical bullets, the new ones, went right through. So if you got a chest wound in the Civil War, you were more likely to live. If you got a stomach wound, you were most likely going to die. Then, well, let me go, I'll come back to this. So both sides were unprepared for the amount of devastation and death, because if you guys remember, the way that we always fought, and I, for the life of me, have never understood this, but from the Revolutionary War on through anything that you see, you have these two fields of soldiers marching at each other, and they just start shooting. And it's like, who came up with this way and thought this was a great idea? You should have talked to the Indians a long time ago. They figured this business out. This was not a smart thing to do. Well, when they got those new weapons and they started shooting at each other like that, their losses were just staggering. And so in the first couple battles of the Civil War, they lost so many people that the leaders had to go back and evaluate how things were going to be done. And so they came back and said, hey, this isn't working. And it's like, yeah, you should have listened to that guy that grew up with the Indians over there. He could have told you that wasn't going to work a long time ago. But anyway, injured soldiers in the beginning laid as long as 3 days on the battlefield because they didn't have the methods perfected. They weren't ready for the number of wounded. And so they didn't have a system down. They didn't have ambulances or wagons ready. And so they had no way to get these guys off the battlefield into any kind of a hospital, which they also were not prepared to work with that many. Now I want to read you a story about, and Debbie asked me one time, she goes, how do you find all this information? And it's like, I just go down all these rabbit holes. And so, you're reading along and it says, for more information, click here. And so, knock on wood, I haven't gotten any viruses yet. But this is called the Indomitable Richard Snowden Andrews, Confederate States of America. Andrews, and listen to where he was from, a Baltimore architect born in Washington, D.C., had come from a family of Irish immigrants and soldiers. But just as the state of Maryland was divided in her loyalty, so was the Andrews family. So he became a Confederate loyalist, even though he was born in Washington, D.C. and lived in Maryland. And he lobbied vigorously for Maryland's secession from the Union in the spring of 1861. At the young age of 30, he was already an accomplished architect in his civilian life. However, he left his wife, his pregnant wife, and 3 little kids because he was very dedicated to the Southern cause. And so he left them and joined the Southern Army. In the summer of 1861, he was basically throwing away a promising future and a fortune. His convictions were strong. In the coming years, he would suffer greatly for them. Through intellect and force of will, Snowden would become a self-taught and capable artillerist. Now, I didn't look up the definition of that, but artillery is guns and shooting, so weapons. He would oversee the entire organization of the 1st Maryland Light Artillery, from recruitment of the men to casting of the military artillery pieces at an ironworks factory. And he had stolen the design from the Union factory, taken it to the Confederate factory so that he could build the stuff that he needed. Pretty fascinating. So it goes into this whole battle, and I'm not going to read you the whole battle, but he jumps in between. Basically, you have this force of men right here, and they're being flanked. And so he runs out in the field with all of his artillery and starts shooting at the Union soldiers, gets them in the method that he used was never done before or after in the Civil War. He was the first one to do it, so maybe I should read this. The Federal line of battle was marching straight across the open fields against Winder's right, and with the broken brigades and the Federals in the rear and the attack in the front, they would have been crushed and Jackson ruined. Andrews, without waiting for orders, took his old battery, the 1st Maryland, across the front of the 2 brigades in a sweeping gallop, whirled them into battery on a hill 500 yards from the charging line of battle, and opened on it with grape and canisters with such bitterness, vigor, and intensity that human nature could not stand it. In 3 minutes, the charge became a rout, and the field was filled with fugitives. It's the only case on record of a line battle being charged by a battle of artillery. So the man has guts. You wait to hear this. So, as he was attempting to rally his broken brigades, a shell knocked him from his horse. The horse was dead, and he was nearly cut in 2 by a shell, which laid open the anterior covering of his abdomen. Now, what's anterior?
Front.
Front, okay. It was useless It was useless to harass a dying man, so it was thought by the surgeons, so they left him on the field. Andrew was so badly wounded. He ought to have died by all rules of anatomy and experience of surgery. The shell had torn deep into the abdomen, and the wound was 9 to 10 inches long. But he was of a fiber too tough. When he was hit, he grabbed his intestines with one hand and carefully slid from his horse. Holy stomach. This is a gutsy man. While holding its neck so that he rolled on the ground on his back. He would lay there for approximately 3 hours, and it was later claimed that multiple surgeons passed him off as hopeless at that time. It seems cruel, but it was battlefield triage. Yeah. Finally, General A.P. Hill happened on the desperately wounded major in order to have an ambulance take him to the field hospital. He would have none of that and insisted on being carried to a farmhouse where he had spent the previous night. That's where Snowden Andrews would meet Dr. Thomas Amiss, the man who would save his life. He was a native of Virginia, but at that time was serving in the 31st Georgia Infantry as a surgeon. They looked at this man, and both him and his brother were doctors, and they said, impossible, he's going to die. So Dr. Amiss found Andrews completely disemboweled, his intestines covered with dust, hen grass, sand, and dirt. The surgeon turned to his brother and suggested more pragmatically than sensitively that Andrews was entirely beyond their capacity to help. Andrews retorted angrily that he had been hearing that for some time, but if you darn doctors would do something for me, I'd get well. I once had a hound dog that ran a mile with its guts out and caught a fox, and I know I'm as good as any damn dog that ever lived. So, to that spirited entreaty, Thomas Amiss responded by punning to his brother, "This man is full of all kinds of grit," which his stomach was. So, anyway, on looking at the wound, the doctor said there was nothing to be done, there was no chance. Snowden said, "Isn't there a chance of 10 or 20 or even 100? And he said, "Well, since you're so plucky, I'll do the best I can for you," thinking himself that it would at any rate make the body more sightly. He then washed out the grit and bits of cloth from the wound, proceeded to sew it up using the only needle he had, which was a rusty one. But he was doubtful that anybody would have noticed because the man was so far gone, and there was no anesthetic and no disinfectants. Amazingly, infections never set in. In the course of 4 to 5 weeks, that great chasm in his side was sufficiently healed for him to sit up. In 6 weeks, to the amazement of all, he was dressed on the porch and able to move about slowly. He was drawn to one side. It took him over a year to where he was able to stand upright, but he was back on the battlefield in 8 months. So, with gritty people like that, you want them on your side. So, but then after the war was over, keep in mind he had fought for the Confederacy. So when the Confederacy, surrendered, he went to Mexico. So he must have had an agreement with his wife because he met his family in Mexico, and they were down there for 2 years. He worked with Maximilian, fighting down there too. And then he came back to America and he picked up his architectural career. Listen to some of the things he did. He was involved in designing the hospital for the insane at Weston, West Virginia, the governor's mansion in Annapolis, the south wing of the Treasury Department in Washington, D.C., the U.S. Customs House in Baltimore. So just an amazing story. I guarantee you will see his story in my book because that's the kind of stuff that I love to pull in. And I will use his real name because I can do that. Huh?
You have the
I have it, and he has a good story. Now, if they're a bad person, or I think they're a bad person, I try to change their name because they might have relatives out there who would come after me. But in this case, he had a wonderful story, a very, very strong, tough man. And so I'll incorporate his story somewhere. And since one of my characters is a nurse in the hospital, and for those of you that have read the other books, I've already pulled in Doc Williams, who was a surgeon in the Civil War. I've already pulled him in. And if you remember, Rowdy Rankin was a sniper, and I've already pulled him in. In fact, I think I'm going to have him be the one that shoots my main character. So, anyway, I don't know how long you want me to talk, but I'm only on page 2, and I have more to go. So another thing that I want to get into is the prisoner exchange. And this, in the beginning of the war, they did a lot of exchanging of prisoners, and particularly they exchanged the wounded, which made sense because, you know, if you have limited resources, why do you want to work to keep somebody else's soldiers alive? And the same way with the prisoners. You know, you have an X amount of money, let's don't keep those prisoners. Well, as with anything that has to do with the government, they got in the middle of things and stirred it all up and tried to put too many rules on it, and then nobody could agree. So in the beginning, they had a lot of prisoner exchanges. Unfortunately, well, I guess logically, they didn't want these prisoners to go back and fight on the field. And so, particularly in the North, I don't think the South was as careful of telling what their prisoners did. But in the North, they didn't want these prisoners, or maybe they had agreed with it, probably had agreed to it. Somebody cared if they kept their word. That was kind of unusual. But anyway, so they would tell these men in their parolee agreement, it said that they couldn't carry a weapon, they couldn't be involved in any type of military drill or fighting. Well, that meant that they couldn't do guard duty. They couldn't do anything. They were just like sitting around here on these posts. Well, again, they weren't prepared for the number of men that they had, and so they would go from these Confederate prisons where they starved to death because the Confederacy didn't have enough money to feed its own people, let alone a bunch of Yankee prisoners. So they came back very malnourished, and then they were put into these camps where there wasn't enough food. Well, you had anarchy and chaos. And so the more prisoners they got, the more powerful the prisoners became, and they would refuse to work. You know, we don't have to do anything. Our parolee says we don't have to do that. And so if they would try to enforce it with somebody, then all the prisoners would come together and take that person out of jail, or break down the sutler's house, you know, his sutler's store, and steal everything, like dismantle the whole thing and put for the wood that was in the store. And so there were just a lot of the officers were super frustrated about the whole process anyway. Then when you introduce into that, in 1862, everything came to a head when black soldiers were accepted into the Union Army, because now we're going to have some black prisoners. And so after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, even more blacks, and at one time, nearly 200,000 of them served in the Civil War. Well, the Confederacy wanted to say, we aren't going to recognize them as human beings. We're going to recognize them as slaves. And if they are captured, we're going to return them to slavery. Well, you know how well that went over. And so, anyway, everything started to break down. So by the time the Battle of Chickamauga takes place, which is where I'm going to go with this book, is in 1863, all that had broken down already. Because by Union policy stated in May 25th, 1863, no Confederate officers would be paroled or exchanged. So when the Confederacies came out and said, we're going to keep the black prisoners and make them slaves, then the Union came back and said, well, we're not going to return any of your officers to you. We're going to keep them all. And so it was the beginning of the end. Now, General Grant was pretty powerful at that time. He was also one of them that was a very good friend of Custer's. So he's the one that got Custer back in the field. He was against all prisoner exchange. And when you listen to what he says, it makes some sense. Now, the public was all for prisoner exchange. Because if you remember, because of where they were, these were their family members. Whether they were Confederate or whether they were Union, they would be coming to the same towns. You know, now, the majority of them in the South were Confederates, but not all of them. Same way in the North. The majority were Union, but not all of them. But they wanted their family members back. So the public was pushing for prisoner exchanges. So this is General Grant's quote. It's hard on our men held in Southern prisons not to exchange them, but it is humanity to those left in the ranks to fight our battle. Every man we hold when released on parole or otherwise becomes an active soldier against us at once, either directly or indirectly, which was true, because they didn't change their loyalties. If we commence a system of exchange which liberates all the prisoners taken, we will have to fight them on until the whole South is exterminated. If we hold those caught, they will amount to no more than dead men. Well, that's pretty harsh, and it was in a lot of cases true, because over 30,000 Union captives and 25,000 Confederate captives died in the Civil War in prison camps. Now, if you think about that, war was only 4 years long, so they lost a lot of men in those prison camps. So anyway, the exchange was restarted, and after the war ended, they tried to escalate it, but it was too late obviously for all those men that died because of the horrible conditions. There were few records of the Confederate hospitals because a lot of the records were burned, but I do have, I did find some records of different doctors, and we talked about the shells and the amputations. One of the things that they talked about on the legs, these conical balls, when they went in, they shattered the bone. And because they didn't have the capability to fix that kind of a break, those legs had to be amputated. And what it said was if it came up closer to the joint, that bone was softer and it wouldn't cause as much damage. So it sounds like they were cutting off parts of it, so he'd probably be shorter on one leg than the other. Now I'm going to have to read that again, but resection, isn't that what it means? You're cutting off part of the bone? Yeah, so you're cutting off the part that's damaged and then putting that back together. So you've got two legs, just one's like 4 inches shorter than the other. So, but anyway, and the Battle of Chickamauga, one of the things that I was really impressed with that I read was when they went out and picked up the wounded, they picked up both sides. And both sides did that. So they would pick up the wounded. The Confederates would pick up Union and Confederate. The Union would pick up Union and Confederate. And now I'm sure when they treated them, because they were so massively understaffed and overextended, that they were treated last. But they were picked up. They were not left on the battlefields in most cases. At least they weren't supposed to be. So that brings me back then to the novels themselves. So this is some of the books that I've picked up. This is the research that I've done so far. When I find things and I start traveling down all my rabbit holes, I put together notebooks and have everything tabbed here, and I highlight the stuff that I use because this is what I go back to then when I'm writing the prologue. And I don't know, this book, with all the information I found, this prologue could just get way too long. I don't know, I'll have to really condense it down. But anyway, it's been pretty fascinating. So like I said, each novel is usually around 100,000 words, and then I add the prologue onto that, which is between 3,000 and 5,000 words. I might try to stop this one at 95,000 just because I know the prologue could go a little bit longer. I don't know yet how it's going to end. I'm pretty sure I know where they're going to end up, where the main characters are going to end up. And if you want me to, I can read you a page and a half out of this. Would you like to hear it?
Yeah. Yes.
So, September 1, 1863, Chapter 1, Red Legs. A large sorrel horse charged into the farmyard and slid to a stop. The young woman who dropped to the ground had a smile on her face. Her reddish-brown hair hung in a long braid down her back, and her green eyes sparkled. "That was a fine ride, Deuce. You love to run, and I love to ride fast." She hugged the horse's neck as she turned toward the barn. He nickered and pushed against her back as he followed her. She stopped with a laugh and hugged his neck again. "Fine, I will get you an apple, but only if you behave." She turned toward the house where a tall, middle-aged woman stood in the doorway. "Ava, how many times have I told you that young ladies of 18 should ride more respectable? Goodness, what would your father say if he saw you riding a straddle like that, and in breeches, too?" Before Ava could answer, an old woman with bright eyes that snapped and danced stepped through the door and laughed. "Ah, Mary, she reminds me of myself when I was her age. I wore pants, too. Of course, we were so poor I couldn't afford any dresses, so Alfred's father let me wear his." Her wrinkled face broke into a grin, and she whispered to her daughter-in-law, I'm not going to tell you what he whispered. You have to wait for that. Mary stared at her mother-in-law in horror. The old lady laughed and winked. I went back, and now I'm turning red. I went back and forth whether I was going to put this comment in there or not, and then I decided to, because this little lady, she's really something else. Come, Ava, bring Deuce up here and I'll share my apple with him. My, how I love that horse. He is a picture of the first stud raised on this farm. Jewel was his name, and he was your grandfather's favorite, you know. Oh, Granny, I do wish you would go riding with me again. There are so many places you've told me about, and I just can't find them all. All three women stopped and turned to look down the lane as a young boy raced his horse toward them. Ava grabbed Deuce's reins as the horse tried to shy and run. Redlegs, about 15 of them. They're a couple miles behind me. They're evicting everyone in their path and burning down nearly everybody's house. You need to get out now. My pa said to warn everyone within 15 miles, and your place is the next one on this road. His face turned slightly red as he looked at Ava. Paul said to tell the young women to hide. He said they won't be safe. Both Ava and Mary stared at the young man, but Granny reacted quickly. Ava, you grab that pillowcase I showed you last week and run up to your room in the loft. You pack every piece of clothing you own in my valise and climb out your window. You need to get as high as you can in that big oak tree. Now go. Mary's face blanched white and she put her hand over her heart. Ava turned quickly to the young man. George, take Deuce. Don't turn him loose until you're at the next farm. I don't want him to be taken, and he will come home on his own. In fact, you'll be able to ride faster if you have 2 horses to trade between you while you ride. Go, get out of here before they see you. Now, one of the things that they talked about at the quilt turning, remember the lady said that they would keep big tubs of water by the door, and they would dunk those quilts in the water, because one of the things that they stole were the quilts. And so, and that was something that really fascinated me too. So I brought that into it. There's going to be one quilt that didn't get in the bucket. That one gets taken, and that quilt's going to play a part through this story. And then I have a friend who is a quilter, and we also judge foods together at county fairs. And so I was telling her about this. Now this is just a sampling of some of the fabric that she had to show me. But she is going to make me a little sampler quilt that reflects some of the Civil War patterns and fabrics that were used. And the one that she sent me was called General Order 11. So she's going to make me a sampler of that I can put on my table to carry to all these different events. So, but anyway, they would put these quilts in this big bucket of water, and that made them too heavy to carry. And so that was how they saved their quilts. So
Sensible.
So the grandma in this one, I usually like to find some older person who's spunky, kind of like Neva. Somebody who's spunky and sassy and has a lot of grit, a great sense of humor, and that's what this grandma is. The young girl, Ava, she has spent most of her life with her grandma, and her grandma, before she got hurt, loved to ride. And so they've been all over the hills around there. Her mother's a little bit more prissy, which would be kind of like my mom was. And so, you know, you can pull a little bit of this personality of people that you know into this. But anyway, that's where it's going to start, is right when the Redlegs come to their farm. But you'll have to wait 2 years now to find out what happens. But she was a Southern sympathizer. Her father did work for the Union Army. And so the fact that her father worked for the Union Army didn't matter a bit. And I did that before I read all this. You know, it's just, sometimes I just write what I think will logically happen, and then as I research stuff, you know, not that I thought that was important, because there's exceptions to everything, but you know, you find documented cases where that actually took place. So anyway, questions on anything? Look at that, I'm less than an hour. How impressive. I always run over. So
Let's thanks. Well, just a reminder, all of you may know this, but just for the public too, we're open Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday next week, 1 to 4. But our next event is August 21st. It's a Monday night, 6:30, and it's also on the Civil War.
oh, cool.
And it's a Mr. Will Hayes is going to be talking to us. I think he's being sponsored through Humanities Kansas. I'm not real sure on that. But anyway, you're all welcome. And we have refreshments right now, so thank you.
You guys